Hello, everybody. This is the CUDAN Open Lab Seminar on February 7th, 2022, with Nancy Baym as our keynote. She's our esteemed academic advisory board member, is a principal researcher at Microsoft Research New England. For those of you who have ever been there, this is a place of desire, even for the people who work at just down the street at MIT. And she's also a research affiliate of comparative media studies in writing at MIT. And so basically what we do today is a 2-hour time slot. Typically talks last about 40 minutes, and then the idea is to do and focus on discussion. So you have some added benefit from being here because we all can take part. And later on, the recording will appear on YouTube. And so with no further ado, I will give the stage to Nancy Baym, and it's our greatest pleasure to have you. And it's also our greatest pleasure to have so many people in here. So this is amazing. Thank you very much.
Sharon. All righty. So thank you for having me. It's a really nice honor to get to open this series. Yeah. So I am at Microsoft Research, as was just said, and I thought it might be useful for those who don't know. Some of you I know have been there, some have spent time there, seeing who all is here. We're sort of the basic research arm of the company. We're a very small part of the company. We're less than 1% of the total employees. And we're charged with being what one might be called curiosity-driven researchers, which is to say we don't have a top-down mandate, and we also don't have a product-driven mandate. So in that way, I often say it's a lot like if you got a residential fellowship in academia, only you don't have to leave at the end. On the other hand, it is a company, and there is a hope, I would say, that there's going to be some back and forth between the research that we do and the products that are created, and also the stances that Microsoft takes as a company. And this talk sort of hits on some of those intersections there. I put where I am, Cambridge, Massachusetts, in question marks because we're coming up in a few weeks on 2 years since we were told to work from home. And at this point, we are still strongly encouraged to work from home. We're told that we may go to the office if that's where we do our best work, but especially as managers, we're being encouraged not to go to the office lest it set a norm for some sort of perceived implicit expectation that you better go to the office or you're not going to see your manager, and the manager will start favoring those who've gone to the office. All concerns that we'll be talking about in hybrid work. So I don't really know where I am anymore. I feel like I actually work on Teams more than I work in Cambridge. I'm physically located in Cambridge right now. A lot of the time this last 2 years, I have not been. So that's who I am, that's what I do, and that's the sort of the context that leads us to this work. So what am I going to do today? I want to tell you about this initiative. I want to tell you about some of the findings we've had about how patterns of work have shifted. I want to talk about some persistent tensions that this raises going forward, and then we will leave lots of time for discussion. This is not explicitly an analytics talk per se, but there's certainly elements around analytics that run throughout it. And I would encourage you throughout the talk in that sense to think about what's being measured, who's measuring, what can we measure, what conclusions can we draw from what we measure, what kind of things are we not able to measure, how might we measure the things that we can't measure. If we think about cultural data analytics, the culture we're talking about here is corporate culture, is work culture. So how do we think about measuring that? How do we think about what we want that to be? And how can we assess how it's been changing? So with that, let me start with the initiative. So very shortly after folks went home 2 years ago, the Office of Applied Research, which is led by a woman named Jamie Tivon. The Office of Applied Research is distinct from Microsoft Research. Remember, Microsoft Research is not inherently applied. Office of Applied Research is explicitly applied. That office said, whoa, things are changing dramatically. We need, as we reorient ourselves toward a future that's not going to be the same, we don't know what it's going to be, but whatever it is, fewer people will be spending less time in the office. We have to orient toward that. That should be research driven. So they pulled together researchers from all over the company into the largest cross-company research project that has ever happened in the company's 30-year history. 30, maybe more than 40 years, sorry. 30 years of MSR. So dozens of researchers, and of course you may recall that Microsoft owns LinkedIn and also owns GitHub, so those products companies have been involved as well. At this point, there's more than 100 research projects going on. They're not all research. Some of them are in product, some of them are in marketing, some cross and have people from multiple arms of the company. What we're focusing on now is hybrid work, thinking about what's going to happen and what is happening already when you have people, many senses of hybridity. So hybrid in the sense that people are spending some time working in the on-site and some time working off-site. Hybrid in the sense that people are having flexible work days, so hybrid days where work and not work are interwoven. Hybrid in the sense that some people are always on site and some people are always off site. Hybrid in the sense that in a meeting, some people are in the room and some people are Zooming or Teamsing or however coming in remotely. So many, many senses of hybrid to consider. So the mission is to create a new and better future of work through applied research. And I think the better is important because we all agree as we talk about this that it's a juncture where tools are going to be used in new ways and enable new possibilities. And the technology has a possibility, not just technology, but the companies that are using it have possibilities to do a reset on what the future of work might look like in ways that don't take us back to normal, but create a better normal going ahead. My role in this initiative, I'm on the organization team, and then I lead one of the research pillars. So lots of levels of involvement in this over the years. If you want to learn more where we were a year ago, we released a 65-page report publicly that's available at that aka.ms/NFW URL, which summarizes all of the research that we had done at that time. And you can see it's divided up into a number of different topics. So a lot of this research, not all of it by any stretch, but a lot of it is enabled by the fact that Microsoft has incredible, to say the least, incredible data assets, right? Because if you are a company running Microsoft products, you have, or a university running Microsoft products, you have all of your email, all of your Teams meetings, all of your calendaring, all of your file sharing, lots, things are just data. So plus we've got all the developer insights, all of the developer activity on GitHub. We also have engagements with customers that are the kinds of things you never see in academia, where Microsoft is working with customers, collecting data from them to try to understand their experiences and develop products for them. So there's a lot of different tools through which literally billions of data points are coming through all the time. That said, the studies that have been going on in the project, this is an old chart, but you can see that lots of mixed methods, lots of interviews, surveys, they're alongside the telemetry and other kinds of methodologies. And we've been looking at, by and large, information workers, engineers, some business decision makers. I would say that the research has been IT heavy. We have recently added a stronger focus on frontline workers. So that's that. So what have I been doing, me, myself, aside from organizing all of this, along with a cast of dozens? I've been asking questions around social support for reasons that will become apparent as I go through it if they aren't already from your own experience, asking questions about who's supporting whom, how's that going, are there issues of inclusion or exclusion happening, are people supporting people who are like themselves, for example, or some people doing all the supporting and others claiming all the support. How does this compare if you're hybrid, if you're on site, if you're remote? How might this relate to burnout and job satisfaction? The studies that I've been doing, there's 4 particular projects, 3 general categories. One is a project that was led by my colleague Sean Rintel in Cambridge, UK, in our lab there, where 849 employees of Microsoft over a course of 24 weeks kept diaries about their meetings. So that's super rich qualitative data. And then there were weekly polls that might ask them about something very particular to reflect on that. I also did 2 surveys of US employees, office workers. The first was a panel that I recruited through Qualtrics that was designed intentionally to be no more than half white and to be gender balanced, to try to get a feel for whether there were disproportionate impacts happening or whether equity issues were happening. And then there was another survey that we ran through LinkedIn, sent out by LinkedIn to LinkedIn members, which was sort of a boiled down version of that same survey. My collaborator there was Josh Hawthorne at LinkedIn. And then I ran a quick and dirty survey of Xbox gamers who sometimes game with coworkers. Josh Hawthorne and Simon Jaffe helped out a lot with that one, and some folks over at Xbox, Gabe and Jerome Descarentis and Hagen. And that was well, I'll talk a little bit more about that, but that had to do with everybody playing Animal Crossing and by saying, do people think this is good for work? Is this just a total distraction? What's happening there? All right. So on to how have patterns changed? And I guess I should say that since we have a lot of time, I can't see you anymore because it was blocking my slides, but I'm on a little laptop. But if you have questions, pop them in the chat or whatever, and I'm happy to pause. So how have patterns changed? I want to highlight 5 areas. These are not the only areas in which the project has been working, the initiative as a whole, but they're the 5 that I think speak most directly to the research that I've been doing, and there's certainly 5 of the most significant areas. And these have to do with productivity, communication patterns, collaboration patterns, social connection, and ultimately the quality of life. Because we spend a lot of time working, right? So productivity. This is data about developers from 3 different sites, and comparing 2019 to 2022. And what you see is that by and large, things, at least in that time frame, remained stable, or maybe there was even a little bit more developer activity happening. This is resonant with what we heard from a lot of workers, that they feel they're working more, their experiences that they are working more than they were before. And it also is consistent with previous research showing that remote workers tend to work longer hours. And it's consistent with telemetrics that show that people are work days start and end longer, and that there's more instant messaging happening in evening, morning, nighttime hours. Interestingly, the employees who were already working from home for Microsoft saw smaller increases in their work time. So that does suggest that, as always, one of the real complications in all of this work is figuring out, okay, what is because we're working from home during a pandemic? What is because of working from home? Distinguishing what's the effect of the pandemic and what's the effect of the work changes themselves. A lot of reasons this could be happening. Maybe it's because people are going back and forth in their workday. Maybe it's because, hey, I'm not commuting, so I'll work during that time. I talked to somebody recently who said she looked at her calendar and it was 4 months out before she had time to schedule the commute to work and back. But maybe it's about job insecurity. Maybe it's about people being afraid they're going to lose their job, so they're working harder to make sure they're visible and don't get fired. Maybe it's that people are less productive in this time, and so they have to work longer hours to get the same amount or more done. Or maybe it's that people are just losing their sense of boundaries and working all the time because it's a pandemic. What else are you going to do? And also because you're in your home for many people. So those are a number of reasons. So what do you take from that on productivity? It doesn't seem like productivity has taken a massive hit. People seem to be working a lot, but it's not obvious what that means. Is there good work getting done? Is the work high quality? Are people having good experiences creating it, or is it just more? And we don't want to conflate more with good. What's happening with communication? There's a lot more of that, more. And with that, an attendant loss of focus time. So we see telemetrically a big increase in instant messaging, especially for managers. We see a big rise in meetings. Meetings are shorter. So not only is there's more meetings, there's more short meetings. Unscheduled calls approximately doubled. And along with this has come more meeting fatigue, and also different challenges and opportunities for inclusion, where there are many people who were not able to participate fully in meetings before because of, say, chronic disabilities that made them unable to come into the office, or care responsibilities that made them unable to come into the office. And now they're able to be fully included. On the other hand, there are other people who now find it much more difficult to participate fully, like people with neuroatypicalities, like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or some kinds of autism. So it's tricky what's going on there. And I should say, I can go in a lot deeper on many of these points. There's even hidden slides if you want in the conversation. People are developing, I'm always interested in how people are developing new communication patterns. And we do see people are developing a lot of new practices for meetings, right? So we see people getting more intentional about having agendas and planning how meetings are going to go. We see people being intentionally more inclusive. So we've seen a rise in, for example, meetings having moderators who look out to see that everybody is able to contribute their opinion. Anecdotally, I have certainly noticed a huge rise in people saying things like, Arthur, you haven't spoken. What do you think? Right, so there's certainly people are becoming more aware. We're seeing that in a number of different kinds of studies. People are turning on video to show, oh yeah, I'm here. Although video norms seem to be coming and going and changing from place to place. And they're very contextually dependent, which I could go into a lot as well. Boiling this talk down was the big challenge here. Parallel chat is also a really big thing, as I'm sure you all know from how much time you've spent in online meetings. And we see about 44% of people saying that they're chatting in pretty much every meeting. We see a lot of things happening in that chat, some of which are distraction, but some of which are building on the interaction, some of which is doing the social affiliation connection work while the content of the talk is happening in the main channel. So there's a lot of, we also see junior people and others who are nervous about speaking up or feel like maybe it's not their place to speaking up in parallel chat. So a lot going on in that practice as well. Collaboration. There was a big study published at the end of last year in Nature Human Behavior by my colleagues, Longqi Yang, and this long list of folks here, where they used a product called Workplace Analytics to look at data from 61,182 American Microsoft employees. And these are the kinds of data that they were able to draw on. And remember, this is for every single one of those employees, anonymized, aggregated, all those things. It gives you a sense of the scale of analytics with which folks are able to think, and it opens up, I think, some really intriguing questions around the interface between social sciences and computer science and data science. So scheduled hours of meetings, unscheduled time in calls, how many emails were sent, how many instant messages were sent, how many hours total people were working. And of course, this is also with whom, right? With whom. So network, it's a network data, network. And what they find is that, well, let me say also that they were comparing people who were already working from home with people who went remote. So they were able to see the distinction between, they were able to isolate the effect of of the pandemic context from remoteness per se. They found no effects on connections. People remained connected to just as many colleagues as before. They found, though, that groups became less connected, both in terms of how many groups people were connected to, how connected those groups were to one another, and how much time people spent in those groups. And they found this was particularly the case with bridging ties. So groups that were more distant, people were had fewer ties to people in those other groups. They spent less time with them. And so people and their groups became more clustered. So this doesn't mean that people are becoming isolated. It means that what you see was that people were communicating, as we saw, more, but with most of it was happening with a tighter set of connections, and less of it was happening across company boundaries. So this has a lot of implications for social capital and knowledge sharing and innovation and things like that. We're seeing that solo work seems to have an advantage over work that requires working with other people. So this is a survey about how is your ability to do work that requires creativity and big picture thinking changed. And you can see that while about the same was the most common answer, saying it had gotten worse was much more common than saying it had gotten better. People report that it's harder to generate new ideas, new big ideas, to generate new work streams, to do whiteboard collaborating together. So there are concerns about long-term creativity and innovation. Again, even as productivity seems to be doing okay. So back to productive work versus good work. All right, and then social connection, where I've been mostly living most of my life. One of the things that became really clear, and one of the things that brought me into this project, this initiative early on, was that it became super apparent that people were really missing social connections with colleagues, and they were struggling to maintain them. So even though, as we just saw, there's still tons of communication and meetings with people, that doesn't mean that you're having the social connections with them that you would have had in the workplace. And of course, people have talked a lot about missing water cooler conversations, or the coffee maker conversations, or those ephemeral, informal interactions that happen in hallways, or when somebody's walking by your office and sees you're there, so they drop in and you have a conversation. There's a long history of research that talks about how much of an organization's work is done in that unscheduled, informal interaction. And of course, we don't have the tools that really work for that. There are certainly apps that are trying in that space, but we haven't really solved that problem of just sort of ephemeral hangout space, or pass somebody in the hall space in the office. And people have been working on it for a very long time. As an aside, one of the real joys about being in this project is that I've gotten to work closely with people like Abigail Sellon and John Tong and Corey Inkpen and Bill Buxton. And whenever we hit these problems, they'll pull out some prototype that they worked on at Xerox PARC 20 years ago that's so futuristic still. And you realize, oh, these are hard problems. These are not going to get solved tomorrow. You know, really smart people have been working on them for a very long time. So, all right. So social connection is important, not just because, people don't like to be lonely and sad, but also, as I suggested, because a lot of the work of companies happens in those informal connections. And more we're seeing that people are leaving companies that have toxic environments, that people are leaving companies where they don't feel connected. So a lot of ramifications. So now I'm going to dive for a few slides into my own findings. And this is just very abbreviated, obviously, because you saw it's a lot of different things. But in the Qualtrics survey, this is a list that I generated of kinds of ways to support one another. I would not say it's complete, but I would say it's done a really good job. I built it out of a number of different kinds of scales out there. It focuses primarily on building a personal connection to other people in the workplace. So listening to people, giving advice, reaching out to schedule check-ins, helping folks fight an injustice. And we asked questions about, which of these have you done for other people in the last month? Other people were asked, which have people done for you in the last month? There's an interesting gap there. We also asked, think about the most recent time you did this for somebody else, or the most recent time somebody did this for you, and tell us about that encounter. So a lot of very rich, probably too much rich data for a quantitative survey, if the truth be told. And I'll just highlight this bottom line, which was, I mentioned Animal Crossing, right? And 13% of people said that in the last month they had played with another person in an online game. And 10% said that had been part of their most recent supportive interaction. So not a small phenomenon, gaming. And if we look at gaming, like I said, sort of quick and dirty survey, but I was able to get work with Xbox to have a tile pop up on the console that said, hey, do you ever game with coworkers? We're interested in learning more. And like you saw earlier, tens of thousands of people answered. We stopped at about 10,000 because we hit the point of diminishing returns. Basically, we were asking what's their perception of how playing with colleagues impacted their work experience. And generally, they felt that it increased their job satisfaction, that when they gamed with people who said they gamed with coworkers, said they felt that it improved their job satisfaction. Productivity, they were a little bit above the mean, but much more mixed on that. Same, also mixed on whether they talked about work when they were gaming, but the people who said that they did talk about work while they were gaming had reported higher quality gaming experiences. The people who did not have a good time were the people who gamed with coworkers because they felt like they had to. So I do see some movement toward thinking, oh, well, we ought to get our company gaming more. Our team should be playing games with each other. That'll increase social connection. And folks who felt like they had to game and were gaming because their manager told them to, were having lower quality gaming experiences, which was related to lower quality, a less sense that it, those people didn't feel that it improved their job satisfaction as well. In general, when we asked people compared to now and prior to March 2020, those kinds of things that you just saw that list of, would you say you're doing much more or more, about the same, less often? What we see is that about half of people report that they're doing more of this kind of care work since the pandemic, while about 15% are doing less, and a third about the same. So that's overall, a pretty substantive increase in at least people's sense that they're having to do more care for one another. And I think I hear people say, oh, people are losing social connection at work, people are drifting apart from one another. And I just want to always point out that people are stepping up for one another, and we are seeing this, that people are stepping in to care for one another. And we're seeing this not just at the company level, but also in mutual aid societies and other kinds of societal phenomena where people have been stepping in to care for one another. And so that persists in the workplace. It does raise questions about equity, and I don't have the numbers here, but there are not huge disparities in who reports doing the most work. When you ask, how often would you say you do this? Several times a week, once a week, every few weeks, once a month, can't think of the last time. The disparities are not particularly striking. What is sort of amusing is that you see that white men are more likely to report that they are providing more care work, doing it more often or much more often. They are not more likely to report doing it more often. So interpret that as you will. In both the study I just talked about, the Qualtrics one, and the LinkedIn, but I'll just talk about it in the LinkedIn survey, Josh Hawthorne and I modeled how can you predict job satisfaction from what we know about the experiences of support at work. And the ones that are grayed out here are things that did not predict job satisfaction. And this was a 5-step regression model, so it's a little bit goofy to present it this way, but it's hard to present 5 things in a PowerPoint when your slide is shaped as it is. So the demographics did not predict it when anything else came in. So the equity issues that I felt concerned about regarding job satisfaction anyway, good news. Also, whether people reported that they were working entirely remotely, some days in the office or entirely on site, also did not affect job satisfaction when these other factors were built in. So there's a lot of alarmism about going hybrid or going remote is doom, and that is not the case, right? People can feel really good about working at their company, regardless of how they're working and regardless of their social identity. What are the things that predict feeling good about the company? And this model accounted for quite a lot of job satisfaction, quite a large percentage. So organizational practices, if the company actively encouraged people to support one another, if the company actively offered training to help people navigate communication and work relationships, if people felt supported by their employer, and hugely important was if people felt comfortable being themselves at work. So that goes again to this idea of toxicity and safe environments, the whole concept of psychological safety being really, really important. So having a supportive employer, having an employer that actively encourages people to support one another and trains them in how to communicate with one another effectively. Then also having high quality supportive interactions with others, regardless of whether you're doing more giving or more getting or how many different kinds of support you're doing, and your sense that it is good for you. Those predict job satisfaction. And then burnout negatively predicts job satisfaction. So we measured with this single item. I calmly deal with difficult situations at my job. All of these single item or very few measures came from boiling them down from what best predicted the set in the Qualtrics study. So burnout negatively predicts job satisfaction. When you add in support on top of burnout, it mitigates. It doesn't erase it, but it does lessen the effect of burnout on job satisfaction, or lessen the predictive value. So the last bit from my own work I want to go into, and then I'll wrap up, is from these meeting diaries. Thus far, if we think about it, so we've got some really big billion point metrics, the giant telemetrics, we've got surveys, and now I want to go into these really meaty qualitative things to think about what's actually happening in meetings over time as people are trying to balance things. One of the things that we found when we read these meeting diaries that, again, Sean Rintel and his team in Cambridge, UK, collected, and Rachel Bergman was a collaborator in this, so I want to give her credit for a lot of this insight, was that people were having a hard time between checking in with one another and seeing how they were doing and keeping those social ties going, and on the one hand getting work done, and on the other hand just spending too much time staring at screens and needing to step away and do something else. Again, you saw big increases in the number of meetings and a longer workday overall. So we saw these tensions there between a desire to stay connected to people and a sense that meetings had to be the way to do it, and that playing against productivity and against energy. This quote from one of the diaries, somebody says, I think people confused meetings as social spaces before the pandemic. In my mind, these have always been separate. So if you have a meeting that calls for a social endeavor, like a recurring Monday team meeting, it doesn't just work remotely the same way it does in person. Simply having 25 people show up isn't productive. It doesn't do much to connect people. It's just a drain on energy. So how do you do social space and workspace when this space, the one we're in right now, is the space that you have? I turn to one of my favorite theories of all time, dialectic relationship theory, from Leslie Baxter and Barbara Montgomery. Well, I mean, they each did quite a bit of work, and others have as well, but there's a very nice statement of it in their book called Relating, published in 1996. And one of the things in that book is they talk about different strategies people have for managing these kinds of dialectics. Our relationships are always fraught with opposing tendencies that we're trying to balance. So the question is not, can you get rid of them, which is a design principle worth noting, because often people try to design for one side of a dialectic or another. The question is, how do you balance them? And certainly what we've seen in the pandemic has been the balance has been radically disrupted and will remain disrupted. It hasn't settled, which is this fantastic opportunity for reinvention, but also fraud. So they talk about them in terms of sophistication and the likelihood that they lead to long-term resolution and satisfaction. And at the bottom, you've got strategies like denial, picking one side or the other. And you saw a lot of that happening. That's, I would say, by and large, that's what happens in these diaries, is that people give up and they stop trying to maintain social connection. You see, I wouldn't say that's universal, but I would say of the people who talk about it, you see that common frequently. You see people being disoriented, just being confused, saying, I feel like I don't have any friends here anymore. I don't, I try, but people don't want to. So they're just kind of confused. You see people going back and forth. We'll use this, we'll do the 15 minutes of this and then 40 minutes of that, 15 minutes of this, 40 minutes of that. We'll do this meeting and then that meeting, this meeting and then that meeting. Or you see people segmenting and saying, we'll do social stuff in the parallel chat and we'll do work stuff in the voice video channel of the same meeting. Or we'll use email for work and we'll save the video chat for the things where we really want to be together. So people segment in different ways. Those were the most common strategies that we saw. Very few people talked about finding balance. Even fewer talked about being able to sort of recalibrate and think about how these things fit together in a way that could work. And then the most sophisticated strategy is this idea of reaffirmation, where you sort of say, oh, these things are all really important and they're always going to be in tension. So what we really need to be doing is valuing all of them and figuring out how can we best balance in a way that achieves all of them, given that they're in competition with one another and given that they are all valuable. The only time you see anybody using the strategy is somebody who is using it in her own mind to extend grace to somebody who she thinks didn't balance the meeting right. Trying to say, well, okay, but this is important and that, so it's all okay, right? We got to have grace. And again, I can go deeper with quotes into all of this stuff. So when we get to what is all this doing to our quality of life? On the one hand, there are a lot of things that have been really good, for many people, as I talked about. There's more opportunity to participate. There's more flexibility. There's more autonomy for many people. And this big work trends index study that one of our marketing groups does in 2021, they asked, well, do you want to go back to work or do you want to stay? And you find that of the people who want to stay flexible, they want to be able to stay remote. And of the people who want to be in person, they want more. So people want both things. It's really hard. People want both, and you can't quite have both. So we're going to be having some continued tension. There's also some really serious mental health and burnout kinds of consequences to what we're seeing. I've mentioned the resignation and job switching. So I'm going to skip orders here to just go back to that for a second and say that we are seeing 40% of people saying they intend to switch their job this year. People have been talking about it as great resignation. It looks a little more like reshuffling because most people are moving from one job to another, but that's not universally the case. Women in particular are not going back to work at disproportionate numbers, especially those with children. So This flexibility is really nice, but the flip side of it is that you're always on. Many people feel that they're always on. They don't feel able to turn off. They feel burnt out. They feel unable to focus. I see so many people going, oh, I'm having trouble focusing. Like, oh, welcome, welcome to the last 2 years. People are experiencing higher stress across all levels of seniority. As I said, hardest on women, it's hardest on managers. Managers have more meetings times, more pressures. There's really nice evidence that one-on-ones with managers reduce burnout, but that just means that managers now have not only their own burnout to deal with, but also the mitigation of all of their employees' burnouts. And then new employees are having a very hard time getting integrated into the culture and making friends and also being productive. They're not getting as much done year over year, and they don't know as many people. There's also huge social inequities that are happening here. I've been talking pretty much exclusively about people who have gone to work remotely, but that is a minority of the population, even in the United States, let alone globally. And that's also really disproportionately allotted, so that we see in the US, fewer than 1 in 5 Black workers and 1 in 6 Hispanic workers able to work from home. And certainly in the case of COVID, the disease itself has really disproportionately harmed Hispanic communities in the US. So there are very big differences in who's able to work from home in the first place, what kinds of jobs they have. So you see distinctions based on what kind of labor people are doing. Certain kinds of frontline work obviously can't go remote. That's not a choice. You see discrimination and unemployment disproportionately affecting some populations at this time. You see women and those who are doing caregiving, both for children and for parents, and for those who are immunocompromised in one way or another, or who are ill. You see the people who are having to do that kind of care work outside of work really disproportionately impacted right now. You see people who lack bandwidth because of where they live being disproportionately affected, or people, for example, a huge problem that's happening in India right now is that many Indian IT workers rely pretty heavily on having domestic help, and domestic help has not been available. And so the homes are, first of all, more crowded, and then the women are meant to be doing all of the cleaning of them in addition to doing their IT work full time. So different cultural norms from place to place, and different size of home, affluence, and the amount of privacy that you're able to have in the home all have huge impacts on the ability to work remotely. Okay. So last slide here. As we go forward, I don't see these tensions going away at all. I take it back, second to last slide. So how we're going to balance social time versus time away and time working, I'm guardedly optimistic that as should the disease lift, we will spend, this will be somewhat ameliorated by the return of spontaneous informal interaction. But there will be people who are not going to be physically co-present. So for example, many companies are now hiring outside of their own geographical region because they've realized, oh, I can hire somebody thousands of miles away and they get all the work done. They're great at it. Why would I restrain myself to just this geographic market anymore? So and that's going to raise its own huge problems, right? When you have a group of people who are physically seeing one another and then you have others who are not. How are you going to ensure that the meetings and the interactions that you do have allow everybody to be on relatively equal footing in terms of feeling connected to one another without making people just go to Zoom after Zoom so they can have a cocktail hour without any cocktails or lunch without food. I've talked a few times about the tension between productive work and good work, and I mean that both in terms of the quality of the output of the work, but also the quality of the experience of the work and its impact on the world at large. And then I think we can think a lot about analytics, and maybe we can do that more in the discussion to follow. On the one hand, we can imagine how analytics can be very helpful. right? Like when I see, oh, Nancy, you spent 27 hours of last week in meetings, I say, oh, well, now I understand things a little bit better. Maybe I should make some slightly different decisions about how I structure my life. So analytics can be helpful. They can also be harmful, right? So there are questions about what should be measured in the first place. Are we measuring the right things? And this is something that I'm thinking about a lot as I think about these cultural support questions in organizations, and how many of those things are not measured, and how much richness comes out in those qualitative things. That how can that be measured? How are we going to measure? It's a really interesting question. What are the right data traces to capture? Who benefits from capturing those data traces? Is it the company? Is it the worker? At some point, is it the public? At some point, those things can end up in opposition to one another. I would argue that the person whose data is collected should always benefit first and foremost as a rule. Is there consent? Did people know their data was being used this way, and did they have the opportunity to say no? We've seen a huge rise in surveillance, right? So I've talked about a world where people generally experience more freedom because of remote work, but there are a lot of people who are installing things to mimic mouse movement because their every mouse movement is being surveilled and their eye gaze is being surveilled. And we know that those things mismeasure people of color relative to white people and so on. So there's a lot of discriminatory things that are happening analytically. And then this question of what is there that we really, really value, that we really consider part of what it means to do good work, that perhaps we're never going to be able to get at with analytics, and will be. Right now, we're certainly in a moment where analytics are kind of this magic sauce, right? And I think that there's a concern that we need to attend to, that our love of the ability to enumerate, not let us lose sight of the things that we can't enumerate, but still need to think very deeply about. So going back to this idea of different levels of sophistication for managing tensions, I would urge us to think about how do we, especially, but not just with analytics, how do we recalibrate to build a future that will reaffirm the multiple sides of these fraught tensions without leaning too heavily on one side or another, with the exception of let's lean on the helpful side of analytics and mitigate the harmful sides. So thank you very much. I will stop.
Thank you very much. So this was amazing. Thank you very much. So as usual, you can't hear the applause in Zoom, but hands are going up.
Some little yellow icons with
exactly,
coming off their thumbs, so I feel totally loved.
Very good, very good. Yes, I think we can open it to questions from the audience. Maybe a little framing comment. I think it's quite interesting. Like, your talk was interesting for two reasons, because on the one hand, obviously there's a role of analytics in this whole sort of like trying to figure out how people work and stuff like that. But also in the process of doing cultural analytics, cultural data analytics in the CUDAN group, which is less the 1960s, there was a term called cultural analytics, which was doing exactly that, right? Like analyzing like what people are aligning with and whatever in order to make them more efficient. But like, you know, what we try to do is like making sense of the cultural dimension that is typically not included in, say, what's now called computational social science. Like what are the creative products people do, texts, images, films, and so on. Like, and so, but here still, there is obviously a big issue, as this is a very multidisciplinary effort. And we try to mix strategically, casually, serendipitous, in order to find out what culture is, even the definition of what we're doing and what culture is. We encounter exactly all the problems we're talking about, right? Like, it made me chuckle to think about the Monday meeting. This is exactly the kind of thing I think. And so this is something which is quite fun. So this obviously can go in the discussion, and that's the reason I'm saying it, in both directions. So the audience, feel free to go anyway or the other. And then we do the other one later, I guess.
say I've spent a lot of time in the last 2 years going, oh, it's not just you. Believe me, I've seen the data. It is not just you. I don't know if you want to moderate, Liz. You got
Liz, exactly.
Howdy. Thanks so much for this talk. I'm teaching a methods class this semester and just really glad to kind of hear the mix of really rich qualitative and quantitative work. I wanted to go back to the issues around race that you referred to, and talking about people who can't go remote. Part of this comes out of a discussion among the plenary folks at the Future of Learning Summit, Connected Learning Summit that happened a couple of months ago, where Mimi Ito got a bunch of people together who were talking about kind of what gets lost for Black and Brown students when they leave remote learning and go back to kind of face-to-face interactions in the classroom, where they're often subject to more discipline and more surveillance than white students. So I'd love to hear more maybe about that dimension of race for those Black and Brown employees who were able to kind of go remote. Do they have feelings about returning to an office where they might be experiencing more microaggressions, more, like more exclusion from that water cooler conversation, more kind of weirdness and uncomfortableness in those interactions? So I'd love to hear more about that aspect of your work.
I'm so glad you asked. Last summer, I worked with 2 PhD interns who were looking specifically at the experience of African Americans, some with disabilities as well, and their experiences of working from home. And yeah, I would say for the most part, they did not want to go back to the office. For just that reason. They found that at home they were able to have much more control over the amount of daily racism to which they were exposed. Things like people touching their hair, for example, don't happen when you stay home. And that was a real common experience. And one thing that was really interesting was that when they presented this work to the larger groups internally, the Black employees were like, oh God, yeah, the hair thing. And some of the white employees were like, what? People touch your hair? Are you really? They had no idea. They had no idea that their colleagues were enduring this kind of being treated like a pet on a daily basis, right? So that is definitely a phenomenon. It's really complicated, right? There's that dimension of it. There's also the Black and Brown customer service workers who are under just as much surveillance at home as they were compared to, say, the white and Asian IT workers, right? So it depends a lot on which industry you happen to be working in and which kind of remote work you're doing. And then, of course, disproportionately aren't able to work remotely at all unless they're in, physically more unsafe conditions and encountering more customer hostility as well, public hostility as well. So I would say by and large, the impact with race is that the folks who are able to work from home are having a better experience when they work in environments where they encounter racism, right? So one of my students who interviewed a number of students was puzzling because there was one person who was really eager to get back to work, and then they realized that this was the only person that she had interviewed who worked at a primarily Black institution. So yes,
great,
definitely a phenomenon, and one that I don't think is getting quite enough attention.
Well, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Mila.
Yeah, thanks. I have so many questions and comments. It's a really thrilling, thrilling topic, and of course, it touches everybody's working life today. So I just maybe want to start my row of questions. Well, I will try to limit myself first to one question, then I will maybe have later some other questions. But I really think that it's really fascinating the way you kind of like tackle. It seems to me that this is both kind of like problem that is related to technology and infrastructures, and as well as kind of like working practices and the ways we actually use the technology. So it's not only kind of like that the Zoom makes us slaves of the laptops or something, but it's actually the ways we use the technology. So kind of could you talk a little bit more about that? And kind of I'm also really curious kind of your your definition of good work, and do you think that there is one way of kind of like supporting good work, or is it kind of like different to different people? I don't know how to tie actually these two questions together, but somehow I see that they are interrelated.
Yeah. Well, let me try and tie them together, because I think that they are very much tied together. To the first question, one of the really exciting things about this initiative, and one of the reasons that I let myself get swept up into it, even though it seemed like a bit of a detour from where my work had been, although of course in retrospect I'm like, oh, I see the straight line now, except for that, you know, a surprise pandemic, is that it really understands that this is socio-technical, right? It's one thing when you're thinking about how can we help people write documents more effectively, right? And you're working on Microsoft Word, right? It's something else when you say, oh my gosh, this product Teams that we developed for a very specific function of remote meetings is now carrying the working practices of, at that time, suddenly 40 million people a day. It's now much higher, right? So you say, oh my goodness, this is not just about the tools. What tools that are created for one thing can become incredibly important in other things, and we have to understand how people are using them and use that to shape what comes next. So the opportunity to bring a true socio-technical perspective, to say this is not about determinism, this is not about we're going to fix the problem by building the right technology. We're going to figure out what the problem is, we'll build the right technology, and then we'll fix it. I would say has given way to a greater sense of, oh, our technologies are being used in ways we don't anticipate. They're not serving those needs as well as we want them to be served. We need to listen to how people are using them, how they're working their way around them. And of course, I mean, Microsoft always listened to customers, right? And tried to always did user testing and did customer feedback and so on to try to think about these things. But the idea of, and this connects to the second point, the idea that this is not actually just about the documents we create or the meetings that we have. This is about how people go back to work in the world. So many people use these products, and this company is such an important actor in the remote work and hybrid work technological space, that it's not just about helping them get that work done, it's about actually reshaping how work is done. And we can't pretend that our tools don't play a role in those processes anymore. Or maybe we weren't pretending that they played a role, maybe it's just that we realize we have so much to learn about that socio-technical interplay and how to really use it from a product perspective in order to serve people better. From a research perspective, there's so much that we really don't quite understand, right? About what kinds of participatory research do we need to really make a socio-technical company really, really be? I don't know. But then if you start going, oh, okay, well, so the tools that we're making are reshaping work. Like, I think, people complain about Zoom all the time. And Lord knows I spend way too much time in video conferences, but at the same time, I think about what would this last 2 years have been like if we didn't have video conferencing. And I'm super grateful for these tools. I mean, maybe I'm an acolyte, but I would be crushed if I hadn't seen that, if it had been like, oh, I don't even know, like Facebook updates, it would not have been enough, right? I have needed the connection to others that video conferences have afforded me. So I do think that these tools are shape what we do. So if you say, okay, well, the tools don't create what we do, but they afford possibilities for what we can do, and we can work with people to create the tools that create better possibilities and that lessen harmful possibilities and that consider outcomes that we don't necessarily want and think critically about how to lessen them throughout the process, then we do have to start thinking about, okay, well, what's good? What are the outcomes that we want? What is the moral universe that we want to construct? When we say the New Future of Work Initiative wants to build a better future of work, we have to say, well, what does better mean? No, I don't think this is something we talk about a lot. And I'm thinking about a meeting that we had in my own little social media collective work group the other day about exactly this. We had a book club and we read The Trouble with Passion, a new book that's come out about how undergraduates in the United States use passion as the guiding principle for making career choices and how this facilitates social inequity on a large scale. So we were talking about what is good work, right? Is it following your passion, right? I think it absolutely is going to vary from industry to industry, from person to person. I think that if I take a stand on it, I mean, I can waffle, right? And I can say, oh, it varies on context, and it does, right? I don't want to say like a mining company in the outback in Australia has exactly the same standards for good work as a preschool in Kenya, as a restaurant in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I mean, it just doesn't, by the time you find the one common thread, you're kind of banal, right? So I think what's more important is really to be able to articulate what is good work, right? In this context with the people who are in it, and to understand. So there's a shift, I think, that's happening now where there is a greater focus on the companies who are losing employees and who realize that this is a competitive environment for employers to say, oh, well, what do the employees of this industry want in their work? I would say, if I did have to boil it down to what is that common denominator, I think what the research suggests, from just a huge variety of frameworks, from Marxist feminism to organizational sciences, is things like, do people feel that they're growing and developing as people? Do people feel like they're engaged in a mission larger than themselves that they believe in? Is that mission contributing to the well-being of their community and to the globe as a whole? Are they functioning in a sustainable manner that's not going to bring about long-term harm to the environment or the organization or the people that they're with? Are people having safe, rewarding relationships in which they do feel safe to be themselves and that they can develop? Do people experience trust with one another? I think those are, for me, the qualities that make work good. But it's a there's a lot of philosophy asking that question. So, and it doesn't have an easy answer, but great questions.
Nice. There's two questions. There's one by Viune and one by Maureen Eben in the chat. I don't know who was first, but can we take the question in the chat for Viune? Okay.
Sure.
You want to speak up yourself, Maureen, or should I read it out?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, I think, Nancy, thank you so much. What a wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed it tremendously. So great. I think actually my question was, you had that one slide and it appeared that, things like race, ethnicity, even gender, maybe even socioeconomic class. I'm not sure if I recall. That wasn't in there. Yeah. It was sort of social identities.
Yeah, that it dropped out.
Yeah, they dropped out. Yeah. And I was just wondering if you had any ideas why that might be the case. And now, after your excellent comments that you just were talking about, I think that might be the reason. When you talk about, right?
I think I would just add that that's because the other stuff got controlled for. right? So if you say, if you're a Black or brown person in a place where you feel free to be yourself at work, and you feel that your organization supports you, and your organization encourages support amongst coworkers, and your organization helps you learn how to do that better, and this and that, right? So if you're in an environment, then race and gender are no longer so impactful. So I think that there's a distinction between the individual in a particular context and a social identity as a group and what kinds of jobs they have access to. Right. So we know that people in, say, hospitality work and restaurant work are much less happy these days, right? They're disproportionately likely to be Black and brown relative to people in IT work, right? So you see it, I think, more at that level of occupation. And once you start tweaking for holding other things constant, then that's not determining anymore.
That's interesting what you're saying, and the answer is and, right? Like if we see it through a sort of transactional lens, like the matrix of all the ands that can come together in such an aggregates way, this cancels out. But if we would look at population size and do, some kind of manifold learning diffusion map approach, we would probably find these clusters, which at this level of analysis are negligible and it will cancel out. But if you look closely, it's still maybe hundreds of people who are affected in this place or the other. And so the question is, can this kind of analysis, should this maybe be done like in a scalable fashion that drills down into these areas? So we actually capture, the place that is a neighborhood where 1,500 people are affected by some issue, but for whatever reason, when counting, washes out of the summary statistics. So that is a really hard thing, because then
it goes to these questions of what do we measure, right? And are we measuring the right things to capture the ways in which, if we look at a finding like that and we go, that just doesn't sound right, then are we measuring the right things? Right.
The unit.
There are some interesting things around race and gender and intersectionality that go on that I don't have right in front of me to flesh out. I mean, there are differences in who says they're doing more care work and who says they're doing less, and who says they're giving and getting less. But all in all, that was not what I thought it would be. It was not. I mean, reading some of the literature, you might think, that it was falling really disproportionately on women, for example, to be providing support, and you don't really see that. Or I mean, you see it, but you don't see like huge differences by any stretch. So, yeah, it's complicated. There was a quote from Satya Nadella that was like, hybrid work makes everything more complicated, not less complicated, something like that. And I was like, oh, should I put this in because it's our CEO and he's saying this? And then I'm like, well, no, that's kind of like, we're all just going to end up saying that anyway, right? Everything's more complicated. Yeah.
Yes, thanks so much for a great talk. I think many of my questions have just been covered. So I'm mostly interested in inclusion and diversity at work. So I wanted to go deeper into gender, but I think we have done that already. So then I was wondering, maybe from the same angle, you could comment on some of the findings you had on people with disabilities, and perhaps how working practices were more inclusive for them. And you also mentioned neurodivergent populations. So perhaps you could talk a bit more about those people as well. Thank you.
Certainly. I'm trying to find a slide that's hidden so I can pull up for you.
Yes, I was hoping to find a hidden slide.
Oh, you found a hidden slide. You did it. Let me just say one other thing about gender first, though, which is that just because, well, first of all, I mean, there are very clear gender differences. For example, when we look at when we survey employees, we lose all the women who've left the workplace, and we know that more women have left the workplace than men, right? So when you go, oh, there's aren't big gender differences, remember they don't capture any of the women who found it so disheartening they left, right? So there's a lot of women who are just absent. The other thing that I can't stress enough about gender is that the parenting business and the care work is hard, but that really does fall disproportionately on women. You know, I mean, dads who are doing that, sons who are doing that, brothers who are doing that, all credit to them, you know. On a cultural level, they are a small minority. By and large, that work is being done by women. And this is a time in which, especially with schools closed and daycares closed and so many people ill, that's a heck of a lot of work. So there's an enormous gender tax to this time. And people are talking about things like it set women's work rights back by 20, 30 years at least. So there is a huge, huge gender problem in this moment that much of this doesn't capture because it's looking at people who are working. The other thing I want to say, though, is that the work itself has become gendered in new ways. So, for example, when we're working in our home, we're doing all of these super feminized things like, you know, oh, should I use my halo light? Oh, no, then the little rings reflect and that's not attractive. And I don't want them to be distracted, right? When I walk into a meeting room, I don't have to worry about the lighting and, you know, I might worry about like, am I wearing makeup and do I look presentable? I don't have to worry about the right lighting and the furniture and the angle of the books. Oh no, that shows too much skylight. That'll be bad. I better. So there's an enormous amount of just what's been called hostessing work that I think is going on because you're inviting people into your home. And there's all of that work of turning on your Zoom camera and smiling and nodding because you see that so many people have not, and you feel bad for the speaker. And you might be a man or a woman who's doing that. It doesn't matter because it's sort of that idea of like, I got to make sure everybody's feeling comfortable. I got to do the social, making everybody feel all right. I got to do the connecting. I got to make sure everybody looks all right. I got to make sure I look all right. I got to make sure the environment feels right. That's a very gendered kind of labor, and we have more of it. And now I've forgotten the second half of your question.
Yes, and maybe some other
disability
issues.
disability.
Yeah, disability, yeah.
Yeah, so my colleague John Tong is just wonderful on this. TANG has done a lot of work. If you look at like Chi and CSCW, you can find his stuff. It's really interesting. For example, deaf people on Zoom have a certain challenge, which is that unless the automatic transcription is really, really good, it's very difficult. Most of these software tools don't have a really good way to incorporate an interpreter. So that's one example of blind people on Zoom can have a very hard time telling who's speaking because the only cues to that are visual, right? And the audio, one of the things we talk about a lot is spatial audio. You can't tell where somebody is in the room from your headphones. So what makes a place more accessible, what technology makes something more accessible for deaf people can make it less accessible for blind people, right? And then there's a number of people who are deaf and blind, right? So, those are some kinds of disabilities that you have to keep in mind as you're designing these tools, or even as you're practicing them in your work group and you're thinking about, well, what are the different abilities of the people in this group? Another thing, the ADD is really interesting, right? Because ADD, on the one hand, it's really hard to stay focused on a screen, on a Zoom lecture or whatnot. It's really hard. On the other hand, you can get up and move around, which maybe you couldn't do before, and that might make it easier to manage it. But the multitasking and the ease of distraction is just a real challenge. With autism, the challenge often is, so if it is a lot of work for you to read people's social cues, and it's a lot of work for you to make sure that you're performing socially appropriate social cues, and you've got a window with your face on it, looking at you all day long, it's like hell, right? It's the worst. It can just be completely exhausting to manage reading and performing the social cues of a meeting. It's just the effort it requires can be truly debilitating. I worked with somebody who needed a day and a half to recover after giving a talk over Zoom because it was just so completely exhausting to be there and work that hard for that hour. Also, so people like John thinks about things, John Tong thinks about things like, can we build, if we're talking about metaversey things, but he was talking about these things long before people were talking about metaversey things, can we build avatars that people will represent people and they won't have to worry so much about their expressions because the avatars are doing the expression that, you know, maybe you just click a smile button or something like that. And you don't have to worry about, is my smile the right smile or whatnot. So lots of challenges of all different sorts. And it's no easy answers because again, what works for people with one disability may not work for people with other disabilities. And I mean, generally, I would say the company embraces, and I embrace the idea that when something is designed with disability and accessibility in mind, it becomes more usable for everybody. But that doesn't mean that it's obvious what the right solutions are.
It's interesting what you say regarding deaf people and blind people. And there too, there's this thing where on a sort of aggregate level, it seems like stuff washes out, right? Because I remember I had a deaf student and there were 2 interpreters in a 3-hour free-form lecture who would take 15-minute turns trying to translate what I was saying, interpreting artworks, which was for them, they were completely wasted after 3 hours, of course. And nowadays, this is something where if one is deaf, you can go to recorded lectures and there is now machine, sort of like transcription. So there is more information one can get, while at the same time, the life situation where this might not work may be bad. But, at the same time, people are not dependent on these live interpreters who are completely worn out after 3 hours. And so basically the notion is that it's really hard to actually make this list of where are the pros and where are the cons. And I think that is something which, would it make sense to do a kind of ecological approach and study this basically like the forest and basically for every, take stock of many individual cases, because it's probably something where at some point we're probably not capable of saying, oh, it's like this for Black people, or it's like this for deaf people or stuff like that. So there's probably a whole range of things going on, and this picture would probably take years to actually take a picture of, paint a picture. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would absolutely never say it's like this for X kind of people, because I mean, my own work shows that it depends on too many things for it to be anything for any particular kind of people. It depends on a lot of inputs, and it depends on the individuals, and it just depends on so many things what happens. I guess when I think about, like, yeah, deaf people can access it after the fact. I want to make sure deaf people can also talk during meetings. I don't want them to just be looking afterwards, and have access to the same incoming stream of information. I want to hear what deaf people have to say also, and that will require interpreters for quite some time, right? And yeah, it's an exhausting and an amazing career.
Yes.
To be an interpreter. I work with a computational biologist right now who is deaf, and boy, the words those interpreters know, it's really something. Like, they know a lot of words I don't know. And bringing them with him when he joined the company was part of his negotiations because of their access to that specialized language. So there is a point at which we're not going to machine away all of the different kinds of accommodations that people need. These are not going to be technological solutions to all of these problems, right? Yes. People are still going to need assistance of various sorts. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the huge challenges of this work right now is that, and you see this in the talk that I just gave, right? And that's leaving out so much, is that there are so many ways to look at this, and there are so many points, and it's not 100% clear what exactly is the aim, right? Make a better future of work, but what does that mean? What are the measures? How will you know that the future of work is better? How do you know if you've attained that? If you decide, okay, a better future of work means this, and this, then disability becomes a piece of it, gender equity becomes a piece of it, racial equity becomes a piece of it. All of these things become pieces of it, and they're all in super complicated balances with one another, especially when you factor in the fact that the global flows are bigger and bigger and bigger now, right? So my own company, for example, is now hiring in South America because there's a lot of really wonderful people in South America with tons of talent who have no interest in leaving South America. So why should they not be able to work? They got great lives as it is. Let's let them work where they are, right? So yeah, so there's many layers to all of this. I will say that one thing that is, for me personally, very rewarding about doing this in the context of Microsoft is that because it is a global corporation, a lot of these global issues are on our plate a lot of the time. You always have to think in terms of, okay, this is not just US, this is a bigger problem, right? So it's great to have colleagues who are like at the Microsoft Africa Research Institute in Nairobi, for example, thinking about small and medium businesses in Nairobi and how they're functioning or whatnot. Yeah.
So the next question is by Mark Metz, who's a PhD student in semiotics here. And after that, I would love to also spend some time talking about the network aspect. But Mark, go first.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. Firstly, connecting with the the fact that, well, the Black workers or Spanish workers, that its situation is a bit different for them. I think the same thing has been, like, if not argued, then at least hypothesized in Estonia as well, like for the sort of population of Russian-speaking Estonians were like generally thought of as having maybe more lower paying, different kind of jobs in general. So there, yeah, it was nice to see and make connections. But I was also talking about sort of maybe cultural similarity or differences of sorts. So in your interviews, and so did you also notice differences of opinion? And so in well, basically people who work to work online now, but from really different fields. And you said that those who were like working online before, and basically the increase of work, for example, was like lower for them. And so like, has the change been like different for, like, if you compare, like, let's say developers, like people who work with technology from day to day, and then some other groups of people who would, let's say, who will, I don't know, who are used to doing this for more social work, and also like the fact that the whole culture that comes with it, that I don't know, is the stereotype that developers play more video games, for example, and this would make it like the example you brought also on the developers and video games, that this would actually help to connect with the co-workers, and it maybe it is easier for them, but not for other people. So how do you think about these comparisons?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's hard to say empirically, because what tends to happen is, like, the people who study developers give you their study of developers. And then the people who are studying frontline workers tell you what's going on with the frontline workers. And so that kind of, and whether they use the same measures, I mean, odds are they don't use the same measures, right? So it can be really hard to say. I would say that when we were looking in the first year, and especially at collaboration studies, the kinds of work where people can get the job done alone, definitely were experiencing less hardship than the ones who who really relied on collaboration. So I think when we think about developers submitting more code, like the GitHub work shows, what you're seeing there is a lot of people sitting alone, writing their code, getting it out, having really extended periods of focus because there's nobody walking in and interrupting them, right? And to go to the question, back to the question about disability for 1 second, that's a really interesting piece of it also, that I talked about autism as making it challenging because of all the video conferencing, but the flip side of that is not having to do all of that small talk can be really, really awesome for autistic people, right? So there is a sense of like, oh, I can focus and I don't have to mess with any of that small talk anymore. I can just do the work, right? So people who are working in that kind of work, where it is really just whether autistic or neurotypical, to be able to say, doing my work is just about me doing my thing, and I can now just get rid of all those people and focus on it. That kind of solo work can be really, really productive and powerful. And the kinds of work, especially the kind of work that requires a lot of creative thinking between people. So to bring it to an anecdote, but it's not an anecdotal point. I work with a number of people who are on the theoretical side of computer science, and they, in normal times, if I were in my lab, I would walk past a lot of open spaces where there were whiteboards, and there would be 3 or 4 people standing around the whiteboard, and it would be covered with formulas, and they would be, one person would be writing the formulas and excitedly talking, and the others would be talking, or they would all be sitting there going, and then somebody would walk through by and they'd go, hey, what are you doing? They go, oh, we're doing, you know, and then they could start unlocking something, right? We had this joke because there's these big magnets that say, on the one side, they say, please erase. And on the other side, they say, please save. And you're supposed to leave them on the whiteboard so that the custodians don't erase the wrong things. And somebody in our office made one that said, please solve to leave. So my sense is more creative, collaborative work having a harder time is the short answer. Do-it-yourself work having an easier time. But there's a really interesting study that came out recently in the Sloan Management Review called "Toxic Culture is Driving the Great Resignation" by some folks from MIT and I think NYU. I'm not 100% sure. Anyway, really interesting analysis where they compared within industry resignations to across companies, and they looked at Glassdoor to do meta-analyses of what people were saying about those companies, to look at, and they found some companies within industry were having like 2% turnover and some were having like 60% turnover, right? So it wasn't really about what industry you worked in, it was about what was going on in that workplace. And they did find, like I said, that they benchmarked everything against compensation and said, what is the relative to compensation, how well does this predict job satisfaction? And they found that toxic, or not job satisfaction, but staying in the job, resignation. And what they found was that a toxic workplace was 10.4% more important, 10.4 times as important as compensation in predicting whether people came or went. So I think one thing that we're seeing is that kind of work is really important right now, but also the kind of environment in which we're doing the work is just exceedingly important. Perhaps it has always been exceedingly important, but I think perhaps when everybody is, people tend to forget that we're in a pandemic and they're kind of like, oh, I should be able to do all of these things all the time, right? And we kind of forget that, like, we're all walking around with 10,000 pounds on our shoulders, right? And we're like, why can't I run fast? I used to be able to run fast. It's like, well, because you're like carrying an incredibly heavy load. Everybody in the whole wide world is right now, unless they're in denial. So I think that it's just it's useful to keep that in mind, and to realize that the way that well-being and happiness and sticking with your job and feeling good about things seems to be working is clearly there are some fields and kinds of work where it's just a disaster. It's a horrible time to be a nurse or a doctor or a hospital worker or a school teacher or a daycare worker. There's no question that those are just dramatically more difficult jobs than they ever were before. But within industry, there's huge differences, right? So we have a lot of power in all of this. I think is one of the things that I take away from all of this. It's really hard to look across all of it and go, this is what's good, this is what's bad, but you can see pretty clearly some folks are doing it right and some are not, right? Some folks have employees who, despite the burden, feel like they're doing pretty well and they're staying put. And then we have others where folks are fleeing.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Babbly answer.
That's actually quite a good bridge to this issue of the network. So maybe I should hook it to some personal anecdote. So I had the pleasure to grow up in Munich academically, which still has this coffee house culture where you can bathe in people, and basically like in a lab, and that's where I ended up later. Where you hang out together, you do your thing, but then you work on your own thing, you drink coffee, but then you chat across the table. There's like exactly this kind of interaction going on. While the other extreme is you go to the library and you sit in your Cartesian cubicle, and basically every book on earth is present, and you don't have to talk to somebody. So I'm a sort of part-time introvert, part-time extrovert, which I need this perfect sort of isolation, and I want to bathe in people. And the interesting thing is, coming into the pandemic, I went out of a phase of monographic work, and I was very happy to finally again bathe in people. And so now we're bathing together in Zoom, and everybody who joined CUDAN wants this kind of interaction. But we're trying really hard. Obviously, it's exactly as you say, we carry around 10,000 pounds. And again, we're sitting in little cubicles. And so what we're showing from this Nature Human Behavior paper, the network effects are actually quite striking. So the thing that, cross-group bridges have been decreased, clustering has gone up, which meaning that people who are connected are about a topic they already know. One has to assume they're more echo chambery, but there is less exchange. And this is exactly, by the way, what we do in CUDAN. There's people from, we may not look at diverse, but discipline-wise, we're very, very diverse. So there's very qualitative, theoretical people on one end, and then mathematical, computational, art, people who focus on material, people who focus on data, people who focus on theory. So the idea is actually to come together and sort of search for this misunderstanding so we can actually solve them. But exactly that is sort of going out the door with the pandemic. But what's interesting is that going out the door is exactly the right reaction as humans in physical contact you want to have, because that's how you actually cut the chain of transmission. Right, so you don't want to jump from one family group to the other family group, or from one work group to the other work group, because the phenomena you describe are exactly what, for example, makes the flu viable. Right, it would never be pandemic or epidemic if it would jump from person to person, but because it jumps from group to group, it works, and therefore this kind of thing must go away. So that the irony is that we're doing the right thing as humanity on the one hand. On the other hand, obviously, we want to still be more coupled conceptually. And this is what's the hard thing. So the question is indeed, how can we mitigate that? Is there, in your studies, I would assume there is probably people who have mentioned their sort of coping strategies. Is there some strategies which we are missing that other than just using Zoom and trying hard?
Well, I want to point out that that nature human behavior, that's all digital stuff. There's no, the virus at this time does not travel through the internet, right? So technologically, there is no reason to break those connections with groups that are further out. It's a purely social phenomenon. There's no epidemiological reason to do it. So I love that connection. It's really interesting. But it suggests that the answers are maybe not technological, right? Because we have the technology and we're doing it right now, right?
Yeah,
this very minute, it's possible. Here we are from all these different groups having this delightful conversation, right? So it can be done. I think that, and this is where I kind of go to, I think people are doing a thing that makes an enormous amount of sense in closing ranks, which is conserving energy, right? It takes more effort to deal with new people. It takes more effort to deal with new ideas. And then this is when I go back to that 10,000 pounds that we're carrying around. Like, if I only have a certain amount of meeting time in the week, do I want, how much of it can I emotionally, psychologically, you referred to yourself as sometimes extrovert, sometimes introvert. I'm the same way, right? When I turn off Teams at the end of the day, I am wrecked, you know, I'm beat. I can't talk for the next 3 hours. I don't even want to hear music, and I'm asleep 3 hours later. You know, I mean, literally, I'm done. I'm done. At 5, I'm done. And so
I'm sorry, tough pause time.
Only got a limited amount of energy to spend on relationships, and relationships and work both take effort. To me, it makes sense to focus on the stronger ties, on the people you work with most closely, to turn to the people who are there for you anyway. And to, I mean, it's in the same, we did the same in our social lives. I think, I haven't seen the numbers, but I think if you looked at it, you would see that in 2020, people spent much more time with their close friends and family. And there it is epidemiological, right? But I think it has to do also with just the psychic, energetic tax of spending time with people you don't know, on ideas you don't know, on topics you're not familiar with. It's effort. It takes more effort than turning to the familiar. And then, of course, you know, if we think about strong and weak ties in the sociological sense, the stronger ties, as you say, they don't connect us to new ideas and to innovation and novelty and so on. And there is that risk of echo chamber and groupthink and all of that. But that's also the people who know you best, and the ones where you have the most common ground already, and therefore the ones that in many ways take the least active effort, right? So your colleague who you've worked with for 10 years, you can say, you know, they know to say something like, you know, how's your daughter? You must be really concerned about her right now, for I'm just making that up, right? But that person you just met, they know nothing. They know nothing. They know not a stranger under, right? So to me, it makes a lot of sense that people would kind of close ranks at this time. I do think organizationally, though, it's a given that it's long term. I do think it's a really interesting challenge. My guess is that when work travel reopens, that some of that will change also, that a lot of that probably was stimulated by not technology, but by people feeling like they could travel for work. But it's interesting and it's concerning. And it's not just, I mean, that particular paper was looking at Microsoft employees, but the same phenomenon has been found in other companies as well.
So this is an interesting thing. There is this this opportunity gap, right? Like people who have a large bookshelf, like many of us, people who can go to conferences, meet many people who are working in a lab environment where there's many whiteboards and they see many different equations, have a better time solving them. While people who are not exposed to that may have a harder time. And that is sort of the drawback, right? So if you say, yes, it's more natural to talk to the people that are closer by. But so the question is, what my original question was intending to say, is there something like a reverberation effect, that what you say, oh, we see this only in technological, so it is actually possible. But because we restrict our contacts physically, does that have a spillover effect to our behavior online? So we don't balance it and say, let's have more digital stuff, but actually do the same reduction subconsciously.
I don't want to speculate on what people are doing subconsciously, but I know that if you got fewer hours in the day and more stress, you focus on what you got to get done, and that just seems more likely to involve close ties than weak ones.
That's true. Liz, sorry for your second question.
Yeah, sorry. And I'm now that people are talking about sort of fatigue, I don't want to drag things out too long. And I see
That's
Alina
fine.
has a question as well. You mentioned the in-meeting chat. I was curious if you could say more about the findings from that. I know at my own institution, they're turning off in-meeting chat because they don't like the kind of ability for faculty to confront administrators, when new pandemic policies about masks or vaccine certificates are kind of taking place. So I was just curious what your findings were about the in-meeting chat, because you mentioned it.
Yeah, that's a Chi paper that is available on the
Okay.
internet. The first author on that is Advait Sarkar, S-A-R-K-A-R. It's called, I think, Promises and Perils of Parallel Chat. And I think it has some tips at the end for best practices. So there's a few things in that question, Liz. They do enable people to voice opinions who would not feel free voicing them otherwise, which is, I guess, why your institution feels like maybe they need to shut it down. That isn't necessarily voices of resistance. It might also just be ideas that people feel like, oh, it wasn't worth raising my hand in the meeting to say. There's uses of the parallel chat which build on the meetings, like adding references to things mentioned, dropping links so people can follow up, answering questions so the speaker can continue speaking, ask those kinds of practices that build on and support what's happening in the audio and visual channels. There's also a lot of distraction that happens in the chat, and many people find that really problematic. One of the best practices that we have this thing, best practices for meetings. It's available on the New Future of Work website, again, aka.ms/NFW. There's this CHARMS mnemonic for guiding your meeting, and the C is chat. So the idea is before you even start the meeting, agree on how you're going to use chat. I will say, again, to go to anecdote, a lot of the things that are happening, well, I mean, not entirely anecdote because this is a finding, but also anecdote. One of the things that does happen in the chat sometimes is the sociality. So like, as we've been talking in some of the groups that I'm in about, should we keep having this standing meeting, which mostly functions as announcements? And people say, well, we need to have it because that's where we have the chat, where we actually joke around and have fun hanging out. And it's the only hour of the week where we joke around and hang out. And it's not because of what's happening in the audiovisual channel, it's because of the chat that's happening next to it. It might be prompted by it, but so it's like everything else, there's not a right way or a wrong way. I think shutting it down is definitely a wrong way, though. If it's a unilateral decision in an inequitable, in a place where people have different balances of power. If a group decides our meetings will function better if we don't have the parallel chat, so we won't use it, or in this meeting we're going to use parallel chat for the joking around stuff, and let's keep the, I mean, you can make decisions about how it's going to be used. You're not a victim of, oh no, chat suddenly made people distractible. Right. So yeah, online classes love the chat. I love chat. I love chat. I mean, my problem with chat is as a Twitterista, man, I just can't shut up in chat. I often am like, oh, am I chatting too much in this meeting? Oops. So yeah, I'm the distractor. Alina, what's up with you? Hi, Alina. Nice to see you.
Hey. Hi, Nancy. Thanks so much for your talk. Yeah, I was thinking about what you said about social connection and how like it connects with equity and career progression, but also in terms of like what you mentioned anecdotally about the trouble with passion. Like these are closely connected, and they articulate across like race, class, gender, and so on. And I was thinking, like, do you have insights from the empirical work that you've done about kind of like broader conversations about future of work in terms of shorter working hours? like that seems to be the kind of policy magic bullet that, you know, that people are circling around, you know, especially now that we're into the third year of the pandemic. And like on a sort of broader level, I was wondering if you can comment on, so you mentioned that, yeah, you're not looking for technical solutions. Instead, this is like a socio-technical kind of way of thinking about the way forward. But is that sort of intention with like regulatory approaches? Because if you think about it, you started off this whole conversation about how Microsoft told managers to stay at home, you know, because like, you know, like stop, you know, because there's an equity thing, you know, like if people can't come into work, then the people who are at work will get ahead, right? So that, to me, not to be binary about it, is a sort of like regulatory way of saying that, you know, let's do this. So I was thinking, like, in the larger scope of your project, do you think that like regulatory solutions, you know, 4-day work week, these kinds of approaches are in tension with socio-technical sort of ways of, you know, solutions?
Just clarification, when you say regulatory, you don't mean necessarily legal, you mean in the sense of a company or a university or another organization might make a rule for HR practices in that company kind of regulation?
Yeah, I mean, like on that level, that's what I mean.
Well,
but you know,
I mean, I think like, right, so I'm thinking regulatory, like you have now and then a country says, oh, no more after work emails allowed, right? That's by national law, we don't communicate outside of work hours anymore. And then you have policy at company levels like Microsoft saying, whatever the future holds, nobody has to go to the office more than 50% time. And if they negotiate with their managers, they don't have to go that much either, but they might not have a place to go to if they want to come in, but they go less often, for example. I think that the socio-technical, to me, is not in conflict with that. To me, it is, if anything, well, okay, let me go back for a second and say, to what extent are things like that in the conversation? Absolutely questions about things like, people come to us all the time and they're like, so what are we supposed to do? Should I make my employees go to the office? How many days a week should they go to the office? Should we hot desk? Should they have to reserve space when they come to the office, or should they still have their own offices? So questions about policy are very much on people's minds as we're having these discussions, in part because when Microsoft talks about its customers, they're talking about companies and their CTOs and their CEOs and their senior leaders there. And so there is an influence there about what our best work practices, quite apart from technology. So Microsoft's taken the 50-50 position. I would say that the other piece of it, though, is that in terms of being in, to me, that is socio-technical when there's social rules being made, when there's technological capabilities happening, when those things are in constant interaction with one another. I would say we do come a lot of times things like, well, what about a 4-day work week? What about shorter work hours? What about giving people less work? These are absolutely things that people talk about and that are in the conversation. To me, they're part of the socio. If you say, oh, well, one of the techno things that seems to be happening here is people just make more meetings. That doesn't seem to be working so good. Maybe we just have a 4-day work week and that'll restore some balance, right? So there is a certain back and forth that's happening.
So there's
days have become a thing also. Yeah.
There's an interesting bridge between the two areas where we are operating right now, which is US/Microsoft and the Baltic/Nordic countries. Sanna Marin, the Prime Minister of Finland, famously, sort of in the news, suggested there should be a 4-day work week with 6 hours per day of work. And so there's actually a Guardian piece that came out in January 2020, which actually cites a study of Microsoft Japan, where they tested a 4-day work week and productivity supposedly shot up 40%. So
Yeah.
Um,
So yeah, so people are fooling with it.
Having myself been a faculty at UT Dallas, like if you would, like, I remember there were conversations regarding stuff like that. And, you know, both as a well-paid faculty on a tenure line or as a senior lecturer who has to work at 4 universities teaching 5 courses in order to make ends meet, that's just, this is a world that nobody can imagine. It's like, it's literally the same as if you talk about fairy tales and people living under mushrooms. So the key thing is that anything one can imagine in something like the US economy panning out anytime in the future?
Can I imagine the US economy having a 4-day work week? Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
I can imagine some companies within the US economy deciding that as a competitive measure vis-a-vis other companies, they're going to offer a 4-day work week. I can't imagine the federal government saying, we now have a 4-day work week. No, I can't see that happening, but I can absolutely imagine companies saying that's within the realm of at least something you can negotiate.
Mm-hmm. So that is then another feature of inequality in a sense, right?
Absolutely.
So I think that is a really interesting point, because the discussion was in a country where then everybody would be obliged to not work more than 4 days, which I think was the plan. And something like that is, I think, a very, very different discussion, which is quite interesting. Why people move one direction or the other, I think, maybe even.
And then, of course, many companies have employees in many countries, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah,
they're trying to balance those things. And this is to me kind of what's fascinating about this topic and why I let myself get pulled into it, even though I never thought of myself as an organizational communication scholar, is that it really does feel like this is a juncture where there's new grounds to have those conversations, right? Everywhere, there's new grounds for saying, wait a minute, the way we're working is not sustainable. And actually, now that I see it wasn't even sustainable before. And look, every inequality that we worried about is exacerbated. And new inequalities we hadn't thought about have become apparent, but at the same time, new possibilities have also become apparent, and new ways of coordinating have become apparent, and new potentials have become apparent. So I do think that, I don't know if the world can rise to the challenge, but I do think that it is a moment in which there is potential to reshape many of these things. And they are, work is as core to human experience as it gets, right? Was there ever a moment in human existence where most humans didn't have to do some stuff during the day so they could survive, right? I don't think there's going to be any magic solutions where there's like, we figured out the 3 secrets and you just have to do this and here's the settings. It's not going to be like that. But there is no better time than now to start trying to articulate what are the dimensions that we care about. How do we know how we're doing on those dimensions? How do organizations of every kind make decisions about which ones are most important for them, where they are, given what they're trying to do, and how can they figure out, are they achieving what they're setting out to do? And what is the role of government? What is the role of organizations? Right now, way too much responsibility is on the individual. Right now, everybody has decided it's up to the individual to balance it all. You figure it out. That's clearly not sustainable. So somehow we have to have these discussions that elevate the responsibility to larger layers.
Nice. So it's 6 minutes to the hour. So there may be one last question by somebody, I guess. Don't be shy. Okay, so I think I got a question. So one thing that I'm interested in the work that people have actually produced. Like Newton famously wrote his Principia during a pandemic, locked in his room.
Yes, right.
And so
quit throwing that at us,
So is this?
For him? Who brought him food?
Exactly. I think he was even having a hole in his curtain that was the only light he would let in because he was so afraid that people would scoop it.
Depressed.
Exactly.
So exactly.
So the question is that something which, again, is there a distribution? Do we see people that have been much more productive in the company and other people who sort of like their productivity ceased for understandable reasons? Is that
everywhere?
something
I mean,
that-
anybody with young children is
Yes.
not getting as much done. There's tons of evidence accumulating showing, for example, women scientists didn't submit as many papers as male scientists. So there's going to be ramifications of who was able to get work done and who is not able to get work done for years to come, that are going to be really damaging to the people who weren't able to because they were busy caring for others. So, I mean, it's only half in jest when I mean, it's not in jest when I say who fed him, who brought him food, because the people who
Sure.
are feeding and bringing food right now are not writing scientific articles at the same pace that they used to be. And they're not doing other kinds of productive things. They're focusing on reproductive things like making sure the next generation of workers exists and is brought up. So absolutely, there's massive inequities in who's getting work done. I think it's worth remembering that that has always been the case, right? Some people have not been allowed access to some professions. Some people did amazing stuff, but they had to work at other jobs to pay the bills, so we never got to see their works of genius. So it's not as though in the world before everybody was working under conditions that allowed them to work to create their works of great genius. And now, alas, we're not, or like, yay, now we're all isolated. So the geniuses can do their thing. I mean, this whole myth of solitary genius, it's such, I mean, you're in the arts, right? It's such a myth of Western culture that solitary genius is a thing that, you know, you lock yourself alone in your room and in your own little brain with some inspiration from God, you're able to channel something magnificent. I mean, that's just.
Indeed. Yes.
We are in fact networked.
That's a good final word. Yes, I think so.
Great.
Yeah. So thank you very much. I need to advertise that this is going on, obviously. So we will meet in the next Academic Advisory Board meeting, and I'm very much looking forward to that. And the CUDAN Open Lab Seminar will return not next week, but in 2 weeks, with a lecture by Jason Potts, who will join us from Australia, and therefore will be shifted in the other direction. So it will be from 10 to 12 in the morning Tallinn time, and it will be about blockchain in creative industries. Thank you very much.